Welcome to the AxeCast podcast. Conversations with interesting people from the world of Acadia athletics and more, talking about their lives, successes, and failures. And now let's join hosts Glenn Hawley and Eric Cederberg for the next 15 to 20 minutes as they dive into the life of today's guest.
Hey, this week on the AxeCast, we've got one of the great football coaches in the Acadia football history. You know, if you look over the last 50 plus years, there's only been 4 head coaches of the men's football program at Acadia. And one of those gentlemen took up almost 20 years as head coach of the Axemen. And it's Sonny Wolfe from Montreal. Sonny, thanks for doing this.
Looking forward to it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, you know what? We always ask, former student athletes, about their path to Acadia. Your path in the coaching ranks started in the late 60s and long before you arrived on campus at Acadia. So give us a little bit of background, where you were growing up and how football came into your life.
Well, I grew up in a suburb of Montreal called Outremont, and the high school I attended had no football. So our street would have 7 or 8 guys, and we'd play against a neighboring street. One guy might have a helmet, someone else perhaps shoulder pads, and it was just a blast. One of the things that I didn't realize about organized football is there are only certain guys who actually carry the ball. When you're playing your street against someone else, everyone gets a turn to carry the ball. So, that's kind of how it started. And then I liked it enough that I ultimately played what was called juvenile football then, and I'm not sure what it may be midget today. And I had to travel about an hour and a half each way by bus to get to Verdun, where I played with the juvenile team. And it allowed me to get my homework done. So by the time I got home, I'd actually done some homework. I probably thought more about the football practice than I did about my homework, but I'm not recommending this to any young folks. It's a good way to get your education done via bus, but that was kind of how I got started. I then played junior, then I played what was senior football that I don't believe exists anymore. Doctors told me that my knees probably would be best off given that I no longer play football, so I decided to play rugby. That wasn't a heck of a lot better on my knees, and then ultimately a friend of my brother's needed a football coach, and that's how I started coaching. My knees told me I shouldn't be playing, and someone asked me if I would coach, and I thought, well, that may be better than hurting my knees, and went out and really enjoyed it, and started coaching for 1 year with a team I had played junior football with called the NDG Maple Leafs, who were a national power at the time, and coached there for 1 year. The head coach, whose name is Brian Hayes, left after 1 year, went to Sir George Williams University, and I followed him and coached there for 3 years. One of the other assistant coaches was a well-known Hall of Fame coach by the name of Charlie Bailey. Charlie ultimately hired me at McGill. I left McGill to attend Acadia. And I think I left out one important stepping stone, and that would have been Vanier College, who have become a real dominant CJEP program over the years. I was there the second year that they had a football program, coached there years 2, 3, and 4 of their existence as the defensive coordinator. Moved to McGill, ultimately became defensive coordinator there, and then Acadia for 19 great years.
So your choice of Acadia, where did that kind of come from? Just because it was a job that was kind of available at the time, or had you kind of always known about Acadia, or was it just job posting need to apply?
Well, somewhat interesting story. I was in the office postseason. I think it was fairly early after the season, perhaps early into the new year. I can't be 100% certain. And then an old guy via Acadia terms, Dan Palov, who was an assistant coach at Acadia at the time, came in and said that the head coach just left. Would you be interested in applying? And I otherwise not likely would have known about that opportunity. So I did apply, and well, the rest is history.
Sonny, if you go back to when your friend said, maybe you should take up some coaching, what if that had never happened? Like, what was the path Sonny Wolfe would have been on if you hadn't been a football coach?
Well, it certainly would have been very, very different. I thought after high school that I wasn't properly prepared to go to university, not knowing really what I wanted to do. Being a somewhat or perhaps very slow learner, it took me 10 years to go back to university. So I started as a freshman at 29 years of age at McGill in physical education. The only reason I went back to university at that point in time was that I realized in order to be a full-time football coach, you would need a degree. I had none. So there I was at 29, 30, 31, and 32 years of age being a student, which is kind of interesting, unique, I guess, in some ways, but it was certainly a time where I was ready to go to university. I certainly wasn't coming out of high school, not being much of a student at that time, not having a tremendous amount of interest in being a student. But by the time I was 29 and 30, I realized what I wanted to do with my life, which was coaching football, and a degree was required. So off I went, and somehow they allowed me to get into McGill University. It's even today, I scratch my head because it's a tough school to get into, and I was not a great student.
It's not an easy thing when you take on a new position. You know, there's the learning curve, and sometimes you question yourself, you know, is this really, you know, for you, when did you sort of hit your stride in terms of saying, you know what, I know I can do this, and felt confident that you could carve a career out of it?
Gee, you know, it makes me think back to the first day I was in my first office, and I think I changed offices about 3, 4, maybe even 5 times. I was in what at that time, or what had been the library for the physical education department, right up on top of the old building. And I sat there wondering, is this really what I want to do? And you know, kind of looked at how hard I worked to get there and realized, well, you know what, this is something that I always wanted to do, and I'm going to find a way to get it done. Worked pretty hard over the course of a number of years. Had some pretty good people on staff who helped me, but I had a real idea of what I thought the program should look like. Following up on John Heward's great success, it wasn't easy coming in after following someone who had won 2 national titles in 3 years. So I had my work cut out for me without any question.
What's the biggest challenge, you know, when you talked about being at McGill, coaching defense, and then you come, now you're the head coach, you're overseeing everything. What's the biggest transition going to a head coaching position?
Well, I looking back on my entire career now, I would have to say that being a coordinator, which I was most of my life, is more fun than being a head coach. Being a coordinator, you just coach. You don't worry about buses. You don't worry about budgets. You don't worry about a whole lot of things. As a head coach, you asked about the biggest difference, and it's perhaps a bigger difference between Montreal and McGill and Wolfville and Acadia than being the head coach as opposed to a coordinator. The very first day on the job, one of the things that I'll forever remember is that the chief of police for Wolfville, at the time they weren't RCMP constables, but Wolfville had their own staff, and the chief of police came in to let me know that previously there had been some serious issues with discipline on campus, and he wanted me to know that he and I were going to have to work very closely together to be sure that there were no more fights, in particular between the Acadia players and townies, or Acadia football players and Acadia hockey players. So right away I knew that, hey, this is different. And he also told me he would have to know where to get in touch with me the rookie night each year that I was going to be head coach there, as well as, I'm trying to remember what the name, it was called the Polar Bear Swim. So the police chief had to know how to get in touch with me every time any of those 2 events. Now, the rookie show no longer is in existence any place in the country. It was at a time when I think things were perhaps somewhat saner. I'm not sure that's the case, but and then Polar Bear, I'm pretty sure no longer exists either. So the police chief no longer would have to worry about those 2 issues. And I think over time, the hockey and football thing has straightened itself out to where they're a lot of good buddies on both teams. So that was certainly an eye opener for me, that the police chief would want to know where the football coach was on at all times, pretty much, but in particular on a couple of occasions. Then relative to the head coaching thing, I found that perhaps the biggest difference was you know what they're going to do. When I was a defensive coordinator, I suspect I coached the defensive coaches a little bit, but as the head coach, you want to be sure what each guy is going to be doing each day, with their individual time, with how they're going to structure their program, not their program so much, but how they're going to structure their time throughout the practice.
So I would say over this spanning a couple of decades, the coaching has kind of changed from when your arrival here at Acadia to where coaching's at now. What are maybe some of the changes that you think that have definitely, occurred over from a 1980s perspective to where you're recently coaching at McGill and finishing up there in 2011?
Okay, well, I think I started out talking a little bit about the fact that I coached at Sir George Williams University with Brian Hayes. At that time, we were 4 coaches, and that was probably pretty comparable to what was going on throughout the country. That's no longer the case. I'm not sure how many coaches Acadia would currently have, but they would have more full-time guys, and we had total guys who were in the case, my first years there would have been one relatively well-paid position. It was kind of, I'm going to say, a half job. And then there were 3, 4, and on occasion 5 volunteers who would help us as well. So the biggest change would be the specificity. The defensive line coaches. There are some teams where they have a defensive end coach and a defensive tackle coach. There could be an inside linebacker coach and an outside linebacker coach. I was fortunate, at McGill, and way back when, I think we were maybe 6 coaches. So from Sir George, with 4 coaches, we went to 6, and now there are staffs of at least a dozen. So that would be the greatest difference, along with the ability to watch your team's practice, following every practice, and really be able to coach guys at a level that I don't think was even was not comparable back in the day when we didn't film practices. We may have at the tail end, I can't recall, but things have changed dramatically in the aspect of you're being able to see and hear from the very best coaches of the game. With regard to clinics that are on, you can find them on the net. If you want to be a good coach, you can be a real good coach relative to being able to see what the best people are doing currently. And that was a whole lot more difficult way back in the day.
Sonny, I want to get into sort of talking about maybe some things that stood out for you in your 19 years here, but just on this whole train of thought with coaching, when you sit back today and you look at the university player or even at the professional ranks, do you sit back and say, I could coach this today? Or with all the challenges that are in the world today, whether it be mental health and all those sorts of things, do you think you could still do it today and coach this generation?
Well, I'm coaching a younger generation now. Since leaving McGill, I spent 3 years at a private high school on the French side, Collège de Montréal, coaching high school kids, and more recently have coached 3 additional years on the English side, a school called LCC, a private school, probably a 15-minute walk from our home. So I'm still coaching. I'm having fun again. Not that I didn't have fun as a head coach, but I'm just coaching kids, not worrying about budgets, not worrying about anything other than doing the best job I can to make our quarterback the best quarterback that he can be. So yeah, I think I still could do it. I would prefer being a position coach today. I guess based upon age, based upon what I really enjoy doing, coaching the quarterbacks at a university level. I guess I most recently did that 7 years ago at McGill. I was head coach there for 5 years. Clint Utley took over and he hired me as the quarterback coach. So I did that for a year and then decided I'm going to try this high school stuff. I always thought it would be a lot of fun and it turned out to be a blast. So To answer your question, Len, I think I still have it in me. I'm only 78, so there's probably another 10, 12, 15 years of good coaching left, and I can't wait for another season to start late August, mid-August, actually, I think it is.
Touched on reflecting on your 19 years here. You won 3 conference championships, and when you sort of look back at those years, Sonny, are there moments that stand out where you say this was, and I know that's a difficult question, but is there something that stands out for you?
There was one particular championship game at Mount Allison that may have been as good a football game as I've ever been involved with at any level. They had a pretty good running back, and I'm trying to remember his name now. He won the heck right in a couple of times, and they outcoached themselves a little bit. Dan Laramie, who's a great buddy of Eric's, had actually left our program, went to the Edmonton Eskimos for a little bit of maybe a year or a couple of years, and then went to Mount Allison as their defensive coordinator. And their running back, Eric Lapointe was his name. Yeah, they were so sure that our game plan was to stop Eric Lapointe that they didn't give him the ball that often. So it gave us a chance to actually go ahead of them, and they were up. We were up, I'm going to say 4 points, and they came down to about our 2-yard line, and we stopped them on the 2-yard line, won the championship, and that was just a great feeling to go into the opponent's den. They were certainly the favored team, and to have come away with the championship was just a great feeling. I mean, over a 19-year period, there are lots of ups and unfortunately some downs, but that would have been one of the better games that I can recall in my 19 years there.
Is there a particular? Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say it was for me too. And unfortunately, we went into Atlantic Bowl, and I probably a very vivid memory of losing that game. Unfortunately, never in my life had I ever been to the point of so close to going on to a championship in that game, but that season was pretty memorable.
Yeah. And then there's kind of a semi-sweet feeling that bittersweet, I guess, is maybe a better term. After being ousted from Acadia, truly the last phone call that I received before we were going to Montreal about 5 or 6 days after I was fired. And the phone rang. I did not answer the phone all that often that week because it was always the press wanting to know what's the real story, because the story was that I left on my own, I believe. Again, old timer's disease doesn't help your memory, but on the line was the head coach at St. X, who was looking for an offensive coordinator. And ultimately I went there for one season, and the semifinal game was at Acadia. I was coaching at St. X, and we made a comeback late in the game that was quite spectacular. I think we scored 3 times in the fourth quarter to overcome a team, a better Acadia team than we were. They were in second place, and we were in third place. And I mean, there's and it's an absolute high because you've done something that allowed some players wearing blue and white versus the red and white team to win. And then on the field, I saw guys in their 4th and 5th year from Acadia who I'd recruited, who were bawling their eyes out, knew they would never be on that field again. So it was an interesting memory. As I say, bittersweet. The sweetness was overcome by the bitterness. It was tough to see the guys who I had so much time for having played their last game and being so dismayed by the loss.
Sonny, over all those years that you coached at Acadia, I mean, you turned out some unbelievable players who went on and had great CFL careers. Just some thoughts on those players that elevated their game and made a career out of it.
Yeah, certainly. The first guy who comes to mind is Larry Justanis. The quarterback is the position in football. The teams who win generally have the best quarterbacks, and Larry was as good as I think there ever was at Acadia. There may have been some guys recently who threw the ball as well as him. I've not seen enough games to be a good judge of that, but Larry was an incredible competitor. He prepared at a degree that would be comparable to anybody, and just a super competitor and a great teammate and a great leader. Bruce Beaton would be amongst the very best to have ever played. I had the fortune, real good fortune at McGill to coach a young man who plays for the Kansas City Chiefs now. He had an awful lot of, he was tributed by virtue of this year sitting out, not playing for the Kansas City Chiefs. Duvernay Tautzif, Laurent Duvernay Tautzif is his name. He's a starting right guard for Kansas City. They won the Super Bowl 2 years ago. Then he sat out to help with the COVID, being a doctor. He's a unique young guy. He was in medicine at McGill and is now a doctor and plays in the NFL. And I would compare very favorably Bruce Beaton to Laurent. Bruce maybe a little more athletic, Laurent maybe a little bit stronger, but had we known what I now know, we would have featured him or got him to some tryouts, because he was, in my view, good enough to have played at that level. As you perhaps know, maybe after 6 or 7 years in the CFL, he actually was invited to an NFL camp and decided that he would not be 100% certain that he'd make the team, and went back to Edmonton. But had he gone to an NFL camp at 21 years of age, I thought he had a chance to be an NFL lineman. Having coached one guy who was an NFL lineman, I think Bruce rates very, very favorably with him. Coach Brian Walling, who played in the CFL for a long time. Brian was actually coached for a longer period by John Heward than myself. But Brian, when he left Acadia, was picked up by the Miami Dolphins and actually scored a couple of touchdowns in an exhibition game. Got a call from someone in the Miami Herald, or I can't recall. They didn't know much about this guy, but all of a sudden he scored 2 TDs against Atlanta, and they wanted to know as much as they could. And they made, I thought, the very last comment from the sports reporter was, "We take football pretty seriously here, but as good as Vince Lombardi is as a coach, there is no Lombardyville." Wolfville and the head coach, is that just a coincidence? So we had a good time, just talking about the name of the town and the fact that the head football coach happened to have a similar name. So Brian would be amongst the best. Paul Massotti was clearly amongst the very best athletes who would have ever played at Acadia. He had a great CFL career. The one thing I remember about Paul, and it was an honest question that he asked me after his freshman year, "Why don't you throw the ball to me every down?" And he wasn't being facetious, nor was he being egotistical. He just thought that it made sense. I can beat anybody on the other side. Throw the ball to me, we'll score even more points. So I always felt like the single factor that is the most important in any athlete is their confidence level. And there wasn't any question, but for that, Paul had a fair amount of confidence. Jerome Pathan played but 1 year, but no finer receiver ever played at Acadia. As you probably know, he left Acadia after his freshman year and went to University of Washington, became their captain, had about a 10-year career in the NFL. So he wasn't a bad football player. I'm sure I'm leaving out some great ones, and that's one of the problems when you get into this and talk about guys that were amongst the best. Chuck Wust, never played in the CFL, but he was as good as anyone who's ever played at Acadia, in my view. As a DB, as a running back, that was one tough dude. He is an incredible competitor. Had he played or had he prepared himself in the offseason, I think he could have played in the CFL. He felt like it was more fun to do other things. He did what it was important to him. He's doing incredibly well, I believe, with IBM. So Chuck is amongst the real outstanding talents that we had at Acadia. And again, I'm sure I'm missing a bunch. We had 34, maybe 5 old linemen who played in the CFL. And it was always fun to coach guys who were good enough to go on and play at the next level.
I was telling Len today at lunch, I said, I recall when you left, you gave me a stack of, or maybe I found them in your office, a stack of CFL cards. And that was a big stack. And those are all those players you're talking about and more players who played in the CFL. And I looked at them and was like, holy moly. Like, Coach, during your time, you put a lot of players in the CFL. And I passed those cards on to Jeff. I said, hold on to these and put those on your desk. And see if you can add some more to it. And I don't know if you ever did add more to it, but I do recall it being a high stack of cards of some of the players.
Yeah, it was always a pleasure coaching kids who loved the game, and we're passionate about it, and we're willing in the off season to continue to get better. So that was always something that would motivate any coach.
I was going to say you produce athletes to the next level. It seems as though you also produce a lot of coaches up to the next level. It almost became part of your MO that if you coached with Sonny Wolfe at some point, you're going to move on and coach elsewhere. And you had a handful of those too.
True enough, and it's kind of neat. The best high school football program in the country by far, and there's no one who even competes with them, is the program that Larry Justanis and Nick, what is Nick's family name? Is a defensive coordinator. Nick Richards. Both Larry and Nick played at Acadia, then played in the CFL. They now coach a team that is much like the IMG of the U.S. in Mississauga, and they would have probably the 40 best high school football players every year. And they play uniquely against American high schools because Canadian schools wouldn't really give them much of a challenge. So they're just two of many guys who've gone on to coach, and they're both doing it, and they're doing it at the highest level in the high school, at the high school level, that is.
Well, you talk about all the players you've mentored, and here we're talking about coaches you've mentored. When you were at Acadia, who did you look up to? Who were some of the people that helped mentor you along in your career?
Well, certainly Charlie Bailey. Charlie is amongst the very best, I believe, who ever coached university football in this country. And he and I had a special relationship. We still do. We don't see each other as often as we did. As old as I am, Charlie's still a little bit older than myself, and he doesn't get to as many games, although he lives almost across the street from Concordia. So at least once or twice a year, I'll make sure that I pick up Charlie and we'll go to a Concordia game, usually when they're playing against McGill. Other folks that I would say I'd have to look up to would be Bob Vespasiani would be amongst them. Bob preceded John Heward, who preceded me at Acadia, and Bob and I got to know one another by virtue of through recruiting as much as anything. He was when I was at Acadia, he was in the CFL most of the time in Calgary, and we would get together. I'd probably spend an extra 3 or 4 days with him in order to find out what was going on the defensive side of the ball. On the offensive side of the ball, one of the real bright guys would be Ron Lancaster. And Ron, as you probably would remember, one of his sons, Ron Jr., coached with me, and a younger son, Bobby, played some quarterback for us at Acadia. So virtually every year I would spend some time in Ancaster, Ontario, which is just outside of Hamilton, and I'd sit with Ron, and we would go on and on and on. And he was, at that time, he was a broadcaster. He wasn't actually coaching the Ticats, which he did a little bit later. And he would stay up as late as I would be willing to talk football. And he was a great confidant and someone who helped me tremendously with my perspective on offensive football.
We could go on and on and on the AxeCast here and talk about football and everything that you've done. But, you know, as we've talked through this, the word that's popped into my mind is timeless. And I can't believe when you said you're 78, because you certainly don't look it. And you're still so much engaged. So Sonny Wolfe, to me, you're timeless. And what you did for Acadia over almost 2 decades will certainly be a lasting legacy here on the university campus. Thanks for doing this.
You're very welcome. Enjoyed it, and best of luck to Acadia this year and you guys. So thank you. Appreciate it.